Right, time for another video. This one will be on presidents and recessions. Now, when a lot of people think of a recession, they tend to think of the president it happened under. For example, in 1837, there was a panic, and it was associated with Martin Van Buren, and of course Andrew Jackson, the president right before him. Similarly, if I were to ask you what president you associate with 2008, you would probably say Bush. Same with Trump with the recession that happened during COVID, or Carter with the stagflation of the 70s. Now, do I get why people do this? Yes, 100%. They are the person in charge during that time, so naturally, the instinct is to blame them. But let's be realistic here. Recessions don't come out of nowhere. They're not surprises, necessarily. Sure, if you don't pay attention, they'll shock you, but the basics of what caused a recession are the same regardless of the time you're in. For example, 2008. What caused the Great Recession? Well, it was a downturn in the housing market. That was the main one. See, building prices had gotten too expensive for what the market could bear, and when things had to adjust, well, things went a bit down. And by a bit, I mean a lot of foreclosures, a lot of people having to default on their home loans, and people not knowing whether or not a house was even theirs, apparently. Yeah, there are people who straight up were sending out messages of, hey, we're foreclosing your house, despite having no documentation to indicate they were, actually selling that house to a person who had defaulted. But the housing market doesn't just get that way. It doesn't just artificially inflate without reason. So if we want to be honest, you shouldn't look at the president in charge, but first and foremost, the cause. What caused the Great Recession? Well, the housing market went down. Why did it suddenly go down? Well, interest rates. This will be a common one for many recessions, but look at interest rates. In fact, you can actually trace the origins of 2008 to Bill Clinton. Under him, there was a massive boom known as the dot-com bubble. The bubble popped after interest rates were increased to counter inflation, and the Clinton presidency needed to, fix this situation, otherwise they would have some massive popularity problems. So what they did is they lowered interest rates and actually encouraged people excuse me for that. They encourage people to get variable interest loans. So, Bill Clinton lowers interest rates, and we see the establishment of several government agencies. I may be misspelling it, but there are two main government agencies established. I'm not trusting myself with the names, but you can look them up if you want. And the results of these three situations, first the two government agencies and the lower interest rates, was a lot of people were getting houses. That increased demand. So what did the banks want to do? Well, they want to get more houses because of course they do. A house looks like a great investment. I mean, you could sell it to a poor family. The government's going to help, and with lower interest rates, good chance they're going to get approved for a loan, and then you can make a good profit off of them. It seems like good money. I mean, what else would you do? But here's the problem. As mentioned with Clinton and the dot-com bubble, lower interest rates means higher inflation. So later, when interest rates rose, the housing market collapsed. Because all those variable interest loans, which are loans whose variance depends on the loan market as a whole, went up People couldn't afford them, so they had to default. They default, that means no one's getting paid for them, and guess what? No one's getting any loans paid off. People are going out of business. The banks relying on these things are not getting the return on investment. Several of them end up basically collapsing in on themselves to the point where they actually ask the government for bailouts. And you have the Great Recession. People blame Bush for that. The US government isn't even in charge of interest rates. Well, officially, it's the Federal Reserve that helps manage interest rates through monetary policy. But yeah, when you actually look at things like, for example, 2008, 2020, the recessions back in the 70s, so on and so forth, you'll realize that it isn't the president in charge often that's the cause of it. There's usually problems caused by the few presidents in the past that led up to this. Everything piled up, and eventually, usually due to interest rates, things finally collapse in on themselves and the recession occurs. Now that's just one aspect. The other is, what about the reaction? And this is 100% in the ball of the current president. Quite a few presidents during recessions, especially in the past, did nothing, legitimately. For example, during the early 20s, one of our presidents, either Coolidge or Harding, straight up just did nothing as a recession occurred in the 1920s. Cut taxes a bit, that's about it. Let things recover naturally. And it lasted like a year. These really big efforts you see in the modern day, like in 2008 to get out of the Great Recession by Bush and Obama, later Trump and Biden's efforts to recover the economy after COVID, those things weren't really done in the past, at least not until the 1920s with Hoover. Most presidents legitimately just let the economy recover naturally and they would eventually pick up. Now, that's not to say they would do completely nothing. They would usually cut taxes or do some other minor things to help adjust. But this massive throwing of money at the problem until things got fixed was really something done until later. And these reactions, 100% saying you can blame on the acting president. Sorry. You 100% can say, Hoover did this didn't work, I'm going to blame him for it and hold him accountable. And then say, we're not going to do that again. Or, for another example, FDR did this was a good idea, let's use that as an example for our recessions, such as when FDR cut tariffs. You could say, hey, that helped, let's do it again. And that's the thing. When we look at these situations, we should, one, notice what causes them, because I'll be honest, keep an eye on interest rates. They tend to cause a lot of this. But also, when you look at the president, you shouldn't look at them as the person who created the mess, unless they legitimately did. Like, for example, if the president passed a law which suddenly caused a recession, yeah, 100% can blame them for that action. But if the thing came from laws in the past, then you shouldn't blame them for the outbreak of the situation, but rather how they handle it. Again, I'm going to go back to 2008 because the Great Recession is the most easily remembered. But all those actions Bush and Obama took, 100% on them, no question. They were the ones who made those calls. They and those in Congress. Trump's handling of COVID, 100% on him. Biden's handling of the economy when he took power and the high interest rates as a result, 100% on them. The president should never be looked at as an almighty. They are not all-powerful. They can do a lot. But they are not the be-all, end-all. Rather, circumstances exist in such a way that when you look at things in the long term, a president is dealing with the result of massed piles of previous actions which result in consequences in the current day. For example, Trump dealing with things now is the result of Biden's policies. His own policies in 2016, 2017 to 2020. It's a result, it's dealing with Biden's policies and Bush's. Sorry, I repeated Biden again. Obama's, Clinton's, everyone before Trump. All of those policies pile up and he has to deal with the consequences of them. We're still dealing with stuff from FDR's term. That is how things are. Things don't just stop, it's all on this person. The only thing that we can say 100% is on the president is their specific reaction to a situation. For example, Trump's reaction to COVID and his general laxness with COVID regulations outside of things he was advised to do. 100% on him. If you don't like it, you're welcome to say why, and you're welcome to critique it. That is all on him. However, you cannot blame COVID on Trump. That would be ridiculous. The dude didn't invent the virus. It's not like we're seeing Trump in the White House suddenly manufacture diseases. Similarly, Bush wasn't actively trying to create a financial crisis in 2008. If he was, he'd be a bigger fool than every other president short of Wilson. Because let's face it, that is a horrible political move, especially if you want to get a fellow Republican elected literally in a year. Yeah, no. That was on previous policies that built up. Bush's reaction, all on him. His spending programs, all him. And I really want to emphasize that again and again, because when we think of recessions and the presidents, we tend to think of the president dealing with it. We think of FDR when we think of the Great Depression, or Hoover. We don't think of the people earlier, like Woodrow Wilson, who put in a lot of policies that were building up to that recession. People think of the Teapot Dome scandal, and they think of Harding. Yeah, he oversaw it, but he wasn't the one doing those things. He's just the dude who had to clean it up, and that's where he can really critique the record. When it comes to anything, especially when it comes to things like the presidency, where there's a lot of bureaucracy above them in terms of, Congress and the courts, who technically speaking are equal, because the whole point is independent branches that can check each other, but when cooperating can absolutely stall the president. When you have those guys, plus their supposed voter base and party backers, basically above them in terms of power, and then you have all the bureaucracy below the executive, you can't blame them for every misfortune that befalls them. You can only blame them for their response and their specific actions. Now, if you can look at a president's actions and the results and say, wait, this action he did here resulted in this, which is how we got that. If you can trace a causal link, do it. But rarely is it the case that the president who causes an action is in office when the action actually occurs, short of a wartime situation. Well, that or FDR being in for so long that all the things that happened during his term came to bear fruit in the same term or slightly after. That's just generally how things are. When we think of recessions, we should think not in terms of, okay, this is this dude's fault, this president, or this party. We should think, what caused it? This, and this. What are they trying to do? This, that, and the other thing. And what will that honestly accomplish? Good, bad, and different. And that is just the functional way that we should look at these things. Looking at it in other ways is just ineffective, being honest. That'll be all. Thank you very much.